Are you excited about the Democrat National Convention and the upcoming Republican National Convention? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we discuss these political farces. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as most of you know, brings you the principled, uncompromising case for libertarianism. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, Professor of Economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit about politics today, but first of all, I understand that this is your first day of classes, or maybe yesterday was, and how's that going?
Yesterday was, well, the Citadel is, like a number of other schools, attempting to do face-to-face, though distancing in the classrooms. But some professors have had the voluntary option to choose to do it live over Zoom. So that's what I'm doing with my classes this semester, and they went very well. The most important thing is that you see, if you're doing it actually face-to-face in the classroom, the cadets, the students are called cadets at the Citadel, have to wear masks as well as you do. And the advantage of doing it over Zoom is that, they don't, because they're sitting in their dorm rooms. And that way I can make sure that they're smiling and laughing at my lousy jokes.
Well, yeah, because that's the way you can flunk them or pass them.
The extra points too.
Right. Well, and you'll know who to pass and flunk by whether they laugh or not.
Exactly. Who cares about the subject matter? Are you laughing at my jokes?
Exactly. Well, speaking of jokes, we're in the middle of the Democratic National Convention. And I mean, what a joke that is. I mean, what a farce. Well, the whole process is a farce, Richard. We'll be going through the Republican one, but all the standard little jabs. And, the way I look at this, who was it that said it? Was it Mencken that said that this is an advanced auction on stolen goods?
Something like that.
I mean, you've got this crooked and corrupt system, and this is what so many Americans don't understand, is that it isn't really a problem of the parties. It's a problem that you've got a sick system here, a welfare state, a warfare state, a drug war state, a managed economy state, a monopoly state. I mean, all these weird dysfunctionalities in the governmental system that really Democrats and Republicans have brought into existence for the last 100 years or so, that it's all under the rubric of free enterprise and private property and limited government. And it's ridiculous. And so inevitably you're going to attract the kind of people that are attracted to this kind of dysfunctional system, whether Democrats or Republicans. And so the fight is really over control. It's not a fight over principles. It's a matter, and a lot of it goes into musical chairs where they just try and they go back and forth. Well, Democrats this time, Republicans that time, and everybody gets disgusted with whatever the incumbent is doing, and so they say, oh well, now we got to shift to the other party, and there's going to be this paradise now. Well, it never turns out that way. You end up with the same kind of dysfunctionality, if not worse. I mean, as we've progressed over the last 30 years here at the Future of Freedom Foundation, we've seen things get worse and worse and worse, regardless of what party is in office. And the reason is because they both subscribe to the same philosophy. And we can call that philosophy statism, or we can be more particular and call it socialism or interventionism, both foreign and domestic. Empire, they both believe in empire. They both believe in the drug war. They believe in Social Security, Medicare, public schooling, Medicaid. I mean, you look at the whole gamut of government programs that are socialist or interventionist. They both subscribe to them. There's really, the way I see it, there's really no difference in principle. That all they fight over is what reform is going to be used, like fighting over like the Postal Service. How are we going to reform the Postal Service? Boy, whoop-de-doo, what an exciting subject, But they don't think in terms of dismantling this thing. They don't think in terms of, for example, open borders to get rid of the immigration crisis, or legalize drugs to get rid of the drug war crisis, or the whole welfare state, beginning with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, get rid of it all, restore a free market economy. They don't they don't think in those kind of terms, and so we end up with this farce where you've got all this pablum that's going on, along with the personal attacks at these conventions. So it's going to happen again at the Republican convention. And so, I guess the upshot of this is that there's really no hope for improvement under either of these two parties. It's the hope for the future of this country lies with the American people, where they finally say, we want a different paradigm here, a different system, as compared to this dysfunctional socialist interventionist drug war, aberrant system. What do you think?
Well, the thing that strikes me often in these kind of political celebration events is how the media focuses upon it. And particularly since it's the Democratic convention this week. And so much of the media is, basically rooting formally or informally for Biden to beat Trump. The solemnity, the awe, the sacred moment in which the political convention is held. And those who have an idea and a vision and a dream of a beautiful, just, free, and good America for all of us. Wait a second, I have to wipe away the tear. It's like a sacred moment. Now, some of us have seen movies in the past where they'll make fun of like these like secret, semi-secret societies like the Masons, where they dress up in the funny costumes and they have the ritual and symbolic meetings and secret handshakes and everything. And we say, well, what are these Looney Tunes doing this for? That's not, what you're reliving Halloween as a 45 or 50-year-old? I mean, get a life. And with this secret stuff. But this is the politics. It's like the political version of these Looney Tunes secret societies. The only thing is they come out on the stage looking fashionably nice instead of like in some type of like clown costume, like you see in these secret society movies. But this is basically what it is, and it's the idea that politics and those who lead the political organs of power, they can create the good and the just. Men left on their own. Oh, excuse me. Men, women, and others left on their own can't do this. No. Only those in political power and with this divine-like authority and vision of the good for all, they will take you into the promised land and take you from the land of the Trump pharaohs that are enslaving you with his peculiar ideas. Now, I'm talking about the Democrats. We're going to see the variation of the same theme next week when the Republicans are present. But this is the very nature of it. The idea that politics is merely one institutional form that serves people in the division of labor, police, courts, and legitimate proper national defense. And that all you're doing is hiring someone to do a job the same way that you'll hire a local sheriff or the local dog catcher. That this isn't a sanctifying experience of like the divine right of political kings. But this is how this is treated. And until this is broken, and until people say, the emperor has no clothes, or like in The Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain because then you see it's just mortal people and not the big head of the Wizard of Oz, with the smoke coming out of his ears. Until we do that, we're just going to continue with this. We have to say the emperor has no clothes. They are like us. With the only difference is they desire power and authority to manage, control, direct our lives, guided by their vision of how we should live and the pandering special favors they will give to those who will then supply the votes to put them in those political offices. We need to debunk this mythology.
Yeah, you make a good point that I think the problem is that many Americans have been inculcated with the notion of looking on the federal government as their daddy, a parent that provides them essentially an allowance. I mean, if you look back at American history, for 100 and some odd years, more than a century, Americans lived, for example, without income taxation. I mean, you made it, you kept it. You kept 100% of what you earned, no income taxation at all. And so you decided what to do with it. So you were essentially the master of your fate. The federal government just didn't have the authority to take your money, any portion of your income. And so people, they could decide to put some away for retirement, health care, just go on vacation or spend it on booze. I mean, this was the idea of partly the idea of what freedom is. It's the idea of keeping your own money and you deciding what to do with it. Well, all that gets inverted in 1913 when the income tax is adopted, where it's now the federal government who is in charge. That they are essentially, by having the authority, the power to set the percentage of what they're going to take, they're really essentially giving an allowance to people, where the citizen then becomes childlike, that he's hoping that his parent lets him have a bigger allowance here. And so the whole idea of the citizen as master and the government as servant got inverted. And I think that was one of the major causes of why Americans came to look at government as their daddy. Daddy, would you please let me have more of my money? Let me have more deductions. Please give me more deductions. Please give me more tax credits. Or, oh, please give me more largesse, my public housing or my Social Security or my Medicare. Please, you're so good. And so obviously, to me, it's like a narcotic. That is, as the child gets dependent on this largesse, he becomes less resistant to what the government does. So, all the flower children of the 60s that were protesting against the Vietnam War, they're now, on the dole. They're on Social Security and Medicare. You don't see them out protesting against the Iraq War and Afghanistan War and the war on terrorism and all this nonsense, which in some ways is just as destructive, if not more so, than the Vietnam War that they protested. And I think it's partly because people over those decades came to view the government as their daddy rather than as a threat to their freedom. Even worse than that, I think there's a lot of people that they never admit this, have come to view the federal government as a god, as their god. And this includes the religious ones. Oh yeah, they'll go to church. Republicans will go to church on Sunday and they'll wear their religion on their sleeves and they'll profess devotion to God and so forth. But they really have two gods. And their other god's the federal government. I mean, it can do no wrong, like in foreign affairs. No matter what the CIA, for example, does, it's okay. It's protecting national security, or whatever the Pentagon does. Oh, it's okay. We're Americans. We got to stand fast. And you saw this especially during the Iraq invasion. I mean, here was a country that had never attacked the United States, and the U.S. was clearly the aggressor here. And everybody united. Oh, we got to support the troops and stuff. Why? I think because they look at the federal government as a god, that and the troops is it's angels, and that we all have to rally together and support this thing. And I think that's the mindset that really is so destructive, along with another factor here, and that is that many Americans, if not most Americans, have been inculcated with the notion that this is all freedom. Their plight is summed up in the words of Johann Goethe: none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. Because when you falsely believe you're free, you're going to be grateful for your chains. You're not going to recognize them as chains. You're going to be saying, oh, thank you, Caesar. I never knew freedom till I learned how to serve you. And I think that's one of the major problems here, is that people have come to view the welfare state, where the government is providing largesse and taking care of people, providing their education for their children and housing and food and healthcare and so forth. That this is the mindset that is inculcated in this kind of society. And I think you put all these things together, and yeah, it's pretty bad. We've got to break this entire mindset by igniting a thirst for liberty and an understanding of what liberty really means. And then at least if people are aware of what freedom is, they can make a conscious choice. They might say, well, I don't want freedom. I want to be taken care of. I mean, there's a lot of people in socialist countries that take that position. But at least it's a choice. And at least there's a chance, because when people know the truth, they at least have the possibility they're going to say, you know, we'll join up with you libertarians and go for freedom.
Yeah, I think this was captured what you were just saying about people just now taking for granted that government is there to do these things for them. Maybe some of the viewers and listeners remember that when Obama was president, and he was pushing Obamacare and other paternalistic growths in government, there was a cartoon put up on one of the government websites, which when I first looked at it, I thought it was a satire. I mean, they can't be really meaning this. But then I realized it was a government site. And it was called The Life of Julia. Julia is a little girl being brought up, if I remember correctly, being brought up by a single mom. So little Julia, she needs government funding to go to school and to see that she has her free lunch at school. Then Julia graduates from high school, but she needs government funding and affirmative action to see that she fairly can go to college. And then she graduates from college to do the helping hand of government. And then she needs government to be there to see that she's not discriminated against in the workplace, and that she has a job that she is properly qualified and deserving of. And then she has children, and those children have to be taken care of. And then finally her children grow up, and now Julia needs to retire. And fortunately, government, Medicare and Obamacare and Social Security there are to assure that she has a pleasant and comfortable last years of her life. In other words, that image, which was the German phrase when the welfare state was introduced during Bismarck's time in late 19th century Germany, from the cradle to the grave. This is the conception. Now, it is true, it is the more upfront conception of the liberal Democrats, the progressives, the democratic socialists, those on the left. But the presumption is, in a de facto way, among the conservatives too. I think I mentioned once or twice when we've done these themes is that I'm a glutton for punishment, so I will occasionally go to some luncheon meetings of the Republican Party here in the Charleston area, and so they'll have candidates and they'll give their spiel, why they want to run for office and what they hope to do, and yes, taxes are too high and regulations are egregious and we need to be more business friendly. And then it's Q&A time. And more than once, I've said, well, all of you are offering yourselves for public office, the Republican primary is like. Could each of you please enumerate one or two state programs that you feel would be worthy of either dramatically cutting or repealing because it's neither necessary nor desirable from the perspective of the freedom principles that you've been enumerating? You hear the crickets chirp. Dead silence. Dead silence. So they want to cut taxes, and they say government is too big. But once you get to the issues, right? Well, to cut the taxes and to get the government off our backs, what government programs are you proposing, therefore, to either dramatically cut or repeal? Nothing. Nothing. So by default, the Republicans are no better than the Democrats. But that's why we keep moving this direction. The left is enthusiastic, happy about paternalistic collectivism and their vision of running our lives and doling out the goodies so that we'll feel endearing enough to reelect them. And then the conservatives and Republicans, they're so afraid, oh, they won't love us. They won't support us. Oh, we'll get a bad press. Well, we're sort of not against it, but we're not for it, but we'll just make it more efficient. And this is their mindsets. And so it keeps drifting towards a more paternalistic collectivism of one variation over another. And this is the system we're faced with. This is the system we're faced with. But this is the role and importance, in my opinion, which you were suggesting too, Jacob, for the believer and the advocate of liberty. Someone has to have the willingness and the courage, because you're going to face a lot of opposition, sarcasm, anger, politely, courteously, in the appropriate times, to put one's 2 cents in various and sundry ways with family, friends, in the workplace, over lunch, whatever. But to be explained, but why does it have to be this way? What makes you think that this program either is going to give you what they're promising, or would not take away freedom that, if you reflect upon it, should really be yours in self-responsibility and self-direction of your own life. And that's why it is so important for those who have a better understanding of this. I don't like to often, use Marxian phrases, but there is one that is sort of appropriate here. Public education and the media's sympathy for all of these collectivisms and paternalisms, but particularly public education through its indoctrination, has instilled in people what you were implying about the Goethe quote, a false consciousness, right? That's a Marxian phrase, that people have been brainwashed to accept a system that is against their own long-run interests. Now, if you believe that freedom is good and that people can make wiser decisions, even though we all make dumb choices at some times in our life, I know I do. You know how I know I do? My wife tells me every day. But if you believe that you as an individual should have the autonomy, the latitude, the liberty to make the decisions that affect you, what will give you happiness, pleasure, meaning, purpose, rather than others controlling you and restricting you. If you believe this, then you need to challenge and question the entire institutional order and the indoctrination that has been imposed through it to make you think that you are free and that this is good, when from a perspective of liberty, it is not.
Yeah, your story of going to the Republican meetings and asking those questions reminds me of, we had a great supporter in the early days of FFF named Bernie Baltic. You may remember Bernie.
Yes.
Great guy. He's passed on, but he told me that every time he would get a solicitation from a politician, he would say, well, I'd be happy to consider it. Please send me your statement of principles. And he said he never got any response from him. like, what is that? Principles? And it's interesting that you raised the public school issue, because you see them all fighting, Democrats and Republicans, over how to fix the public school system. Like the federal government is going to fix the system. But they don't challenge, they don't strike at the root. What role does government have in education? And not just the federal government. This is one of my beefs with libertarians. They'll sit there and say, oh, the federal government, the Department of Education should be abolished, which is what Republicans used to say. That was what Reagan said. They don't say it anymore. But then the libertarians, many of them will just stop there. When you say, well, what about education at the local level? Well, I believe it should be a local matter, Well, instead of making the case for separating school and state entirely, that's what we really should be doing as libertarians, as far as I'm concerned, making the case for liberty. Because if you want a free society, like it or not, you've got to get a critical mass of people that are demanding a free society. And the only way you can do that is by exposing them to the idea, like of educational liberty. Now, you go into an audience, and let's say of 100 people, you can play the safe route and say, oh, I favor abolishing the Department of Education. Big deal. To me, you haven't really advanced the case for liberty at all. But you go in that audience and you say, look, abolish public schooling, repeal compulsory attendance laws, get local, state, national governments entirely out of education, separate school and state. Okay, yeah, 96 out of the 100 people are going to be shocked and, they won't be able to handle it. They're going to do a conniption fit. Oh gosh, everybody will be stupid. They'll be uneducated. But there will oftentimes be 3 or 4 people in that audience that says, that is an idea I'm going to explore more fully here. Public schooling has never worked. It's creating so much damage, destruction of kids' minds. And hey, I'm going to look for that. Well, that's our role as libertarians. And, another example of this phenomenon in terms of education is higher education, colleges. Everybody just assumes that it's the state's role to support colleges. And they never think in terms of, well, why is this? Why not just people be free to support whatever they want with their own money? Now, a college might say, oh, well, no, we'd go out of business if that were the case, if the state weren't supporting us. Well, if that's the case, that means that people don't want to donate to you. And you should go out of business. That's just the way life is. And so I think it's that faith in freedom that we need to restore in this country, not only a faith in freedom, but an understanding of what freedom really is. And that's where we libertarians come in. And that's, let me make one more point here. That's one of my beefs too with the reform-oriented libertarians, is that all they want to do, so many of them, is just come up with reform devices. Like on Social Security, they're scared to death of alienating people. Oh my gosh, I won't be taken seriously if I call for the repeal of this socialist program. Oh, I want to be taken seriously by the mainstream press and so forth. Richard, in order to go after the entire welfare state, which I consider is the second largest infringement on our freedom, the largest being the warfare state, the national security state, you've got to go after the whole apparatus, and you got to go for the big banana here, and that is Social Security and Medicare. I mean, to go after food stamps doesn't get you anywhere. And if you're not willing to take on the crown jewel of this crooked and corrupt system, then what moral standing do you have? You can sit there and say, oh, I want to abolish farm subsidies. Well, the farmer's going to say, why should our dole be terminated when your little dole of Social Security and Medicare doesn't get terminated? And I'll wrap this up by saying that Milton Friedman emphasized this for me when he took on occupational licensure. He could have gone after the hairdressers or the shoe shine people and showed that they didn't need licensure, but no, he didn't do that. He went after the toughest case, the medical profession, and showed why there should be no occupational licensure for them, because he realized that way, once people understand that principle, the whole apparatus comes crashing down.
Yeah, the most important historical analogy of the points you're making is the abolition movement in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. Now, there were obviously those who advocated slavery, especially in the southern states, where it was that peculiar institution upon which many plantation owners were dependent for their livelihood. But there was, tacit or even explicit support for it in the free states in the North. And then there was the abolition movement. But what did abolition mean? There were many people who said, well, how can we get rid of this institution? Maybe we should try to persuade slave owners to be more kinder and gentler, better housing, nicer food, put away the lash. And then you had this, we can't do this immediately. It has to be gradual. And those who said, well, let's have a colonization site. We'll retransport Africans who were born in the United States as slaves back to Africa, where they have no language, no culture anymore. Right? Just throw them away. And then there were the radical abolitionists who said, it's not a matter of having U.S. naval forces along with the British interdicting slave trading ships across the Atlantic. It's not enough to call for people to be kinder and gentler. Of course, it would be nice if people were kinder and gentler. But what is important, and gradualism, how long is that going to be stretched out for? It's abolition now. It is the ending of an evil and immoral institution in which one portion of the population living within the boundaries of the United States is kept in violent bondage to serve others against their will. Root and branch, immediately, now, and to treat those who have been held in chains as how they should be treated, as equal citizens of the United States, regardless of how they look. And that is what we need to have. And now, at first, these quote extreme abolitionists were a small number, but over time they grew because they constantly made the case it's immoral, it is unjust, it is holding back the society from a variety of perspectives. And if you try to stretch it out, the stretching out will be used by those who advocate or benefit from slavery to keep the stretching out forever. And that's basically what we have to be inspired by, the principled position of those who called for the end of probably the most egregious institution that was allowed to legally exist in the history of the country.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think this concept of incrementalism that crept into the libertarian movement decades ago has been so highly destructive. Because as you point out, in slavery, the principal position is not to call for the gradual elimination of slavery. I mean, when something's evil, you have to make the case for ending it immediately. Now, somebody might say, well, that's not practical. It's in the Constitution. You know that Congress would never do that overnight. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you make the principal case for ending it and then let other people figure out what to do about it. They decide they're going to leave it in existence. Well, that's their business. But to argue, oh, well, it would be inhumane to stop slavery all at once. We need to just gradually repeal it over the next 30 or 40 years. Oh, yeah, fine, except for the slave who wants freedom. And it's no different today. And this is what befuddles me about reform-oriented and incremental libertarians. A lot of them take a principal case, a position when it comes to slavery. They'll say, yeah, slavery, boy, I would have been there calling for its abolition. I would have been really courageous. And if I had lived in Alabama, calling for the end of slavery. But when it comes to welfare, warfare state serfdom today, all of a sudden, all the courage evaporates. Now, you and I would say, push the button in these programs today. Make the case for ending the programs today. It's not a question of whether it's practical, whether Congress is going to enact it tomorrow or not. It's making the case. And in the process, hopefully, finding other people that say, yeah, I want to be free. And freedom means dismantling infringements on freedom, dismantling slavery, dismantling serfdom. But this notion of incrementalism says, oh, well, yeah, we'll just delay freedom for 30 or 40 years. Well, that has no interest for me. I mean, I discovered libertarianism when I was in my late 20s. And, you know, back then, that was when the incremental movement was starting within the libertarian movement. And they were saying, oh, well, you know, we can get rid of Social Security and Medicare over the next 30 or 40 years, phase it out over a period of time. Well, it becomes a never proposition. You know, here we are 30 years later, 40 years later, and they're still making the same argument. Oh, well, we have to phase this out over the next 30 or 40 years, which means freedom delayed for another 30 or 40 years. That holds no interest for me. I want freedom in my lifetime. And if there's any chance of that happening, it's absolutely necessary to make the case for what genuine freedom is, which is an elimination of the infringement on freedom. After identifying it as an infringement, then getting rid of it. There's no other solution to a free society, because if you just reform it or you gradually get rid of it, you're just delaying freedom.
Well, the complement to that is the principled case also has to be having with it, I would argue, lessons for Americans out of their own history and the history of other countries that demonstrate that freedom not only is a good in itself, but is a practical matter, works. Now, I'm an economist, and I'm in the classroom. New semester just began. I'm in the classroom, and I'm explaining to students the logic of competitive markets, supply and demand, individual choice, how prices coordinate the actions of multitudes of now billions through a global division of labor without central command or central direction. But people don't understand this. We must be, but though that seems abstract, but you have to give examples. How did America develop? How did England emerge out of feudalism and become a free and prosperous society? We need to debunk the myths that the collectivists of every stripe, but particularly those lefty, commie, socialists, embedded capitalism is exploitive. Capitalism leaves the poor behind. Capitalism results in the rich getting richer and by suppressing others. Now, this has become intensified right now with the cancel culture, with the systemic racism, with the idea of identity politics. This is an attempt to influence how people look upon the past of their own country and the world to fit a paradigm justifying collectivist control over everything in society looking to the future. So when you make the case for freedom, I'm talking about the generic you here, when you make the case for freedom, each of us must have a little bit of a stock of knowledge. We don't need government to manage the healthcare system. Well, but why? Well, if we look at the past, when people were poorer, things were not as sophisticated, look how markets did so through the friendly societies and charity. But who will educate people? Well, you know, even in the depths of the Industrial Revolution, before there was compulsory education, 2/3 to 3/4 of the British population was made literate by either for-profit or church or other philanthropic charity movements to make the people not be knowledgeable in reading and writing. It dramatically changed the society without government. But don't we need government to regulate matter? No. This is how the market itself, both in principle and historically, has generated the motives, the incentives, and the institutional setting in which people are guided, as by Adam Smith's invisible hand, to do things that improve their own circumstances, but to enhance the well-being of others in a process of mutual benefit and betterment. This is what we have to hammer away, because they are trying to destroy this. I was recently rereading some letters of Albert Janoc, a collection of his letters, famous classical liberal. He died in 1945, just around the time of the end of the Second World War. I was reading one of his letters that he wrote someone a couple of years earlier, 1943, 44, in which he said he was despondent because once time passes and these institutions and policies are present over several generations, to the latest generation, when you say, why is government doing this? Or why does government have to do this? They look at you like you're a man from the moon because they can't imagine a life without them. And that makes the task of winning people to liberty more difficult because they've lost a living memory of the workings and the value of a free society. Reawakening that, re-educating that, sharing that falls upon us if freedom is going to have any chance between now and the end of the 21st century.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I really think there's only one hope for achieving a free society, and it lies not with Republicans and Democrats, conservatives or liberals. And we see that in their conventions. They don't talk about freedom. And if they do talk about freedom, it's not the genuine sense of freedom as we know it as libertarians. There's only one hope for achieving a free society, and that lies with libertarians. And if we don't have faith in freedom, how do we expect to lead America to a free society? I mean, there's all too many libertarians that say, oh, no, you couldn't end these social welfare programs. There'd be elderly people dying in the streets, Jacob. Oh, from illness, you know, they'd be thrown out of hospitals without Medicare, and they would just be dying of cancer out on the street. And, oh, my grandmother would be dying without her Social Security check. I mean, it shows you so many libertarians have a lack of faith that you could push the button, get rid of these programs today, and everybody would be significantly better off than they are today. But in order to do that, it requires what you mentioned, an understanding, a study. And this goes back to what Leonard Read, who founded the Foundation for Economic Education, used to say. Spend your time improving your understanding of freedom so that you can make the case for freedom to other people. And then when you gain that understanding, then you can share it with others with the conviction that freedom really does work. That if you got rid of these programs today, immediately there'd be private charities, people popping up to help others in need, family members. I mean, I have absolutely no doubts that freedom really works, that you could push a button, get rid of all these welfare, warfare state programs, and everything would be not just fine, it would be fantastic. And of course, it's the same with slavery. People said, oh, the slaves, they were dependent on their plantation owners and so forth. This is bull. The slaves wanted freedom. They wanted the opportunity. Was it difficult? Sure. But they wanted the opportunity to make it on their own. And a lot of them did very, very well, which was why the bigoted whites started enacting Jim Crow laws, because they were outcompeting whites in many instances. So I think you're right, that the leadership has to come from libertarians, but it has to come with a deeper understanding and a conviction that freedom is not just moral, it actually works.
And if I can just add, I know time is getting short for us to finish our episode. People need to not become despondent or disheartened. And I want to make that case in the context of a famous article by the free market Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek. Around 1949, he wrote a famous essay called The Intellectuals in Socialism. And he pointed out that many people say, well, we have to get the right person elected today, or do this, do that. And he said, well, of course, if you can do that, that's fine. But that you have to appreciate that the politics of today is the lagged effect of the ideas that were being espoused and got percolated through the society decades earlier. So the paternalism, the collectivism, the quote democratic socialism that we see not just advocated, but proposed as actual policies today and aggressively, is the lagged result of an intellectual current of ideas that's been building up for most of this half century among American intellectuals and opinion makers, educators, and then the population, where so many say, but what, of course government has to do this, and these people are just sort of egging it on further. So our task is to change the intellectual terms of debates, how people think, how people look at these things, what people want for themselves and their families, so that, yes, are we going to change the world in this next election or the election after that? No. But change the climate of opinion, which is what we're talking about here, and 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, you can see the change at the level of actual politics. The same way the politics today is the result of those who advocated forms of socialism and paternalism 30, 40, or 50 years ago, and were hoping to eventually see it as a dream come true. We have to have that vision of a good and moral and desirable free society and have the courage and willingness to espouse it and persuade people today. And if 30 or 40 years from now seems like a long time, well, what about my life? Well, you know, sometimes you just cut in the epochs of history and you can't control that. But if you have children, if you have grandchildren, if you just care about people in general, we must be laying these foundations today so your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren can have degrees of freedom that we're being denied, and we'll lose even more if we don't change that climate of opinion, thinking to the future.
Right. And I would add that you never know when things can turn on a dime. I mean, you talk about 10, 20 years, but I mean, this movement's been a long time going here. I mean, you and I got into it 40 years ago, if not longer. And so this foundation has been being built over decades here. You never know how close we might be to reaching that critical mass. And that brings this, firestorm across America where people's passion for liberty is inflamed and they're demanding it and they understand it. We could be closer than you ever know. There's something you cannot know and cannot measure. You've got to just keep taking the right position, whether that's building the foundation for today or tomorrow or 10 years, 20 years from now. All right, on that note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your great support. And remember, this is our mid-year fundraising time. If you haven't yet made a donation, hope you'll consider doing it, helping us out advance liberty here in a principled way. Thanks for tuning in, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Come to fff.org and pay us a visit. And we'll see y'all next week.